The most consequential transformations in history rarely arrive with spectacle. They arrive with reassurance, with calm language, with reasonable explanations, with promises that what is happening is temporary, manageable, and ultimately benign. Inflation belongs to this category. It is not experienced at first as destruction. It is experienced as inconvenience, a price that feels slightly wrong, a bill that arrives sooner than expected, a future that seems marginally less predictable than it once was. And because these sensations do not resemble catastrophe, they are tolerated. That tolerance is not accidental, it is structural. Every civilization that has ever abandoned monetary restraint has done so not in desperation, but in confidence, convinced that it possessed the sophistication to manage what its predecessors could not. They were always mistaken, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they misunderstood the nature of money. Money is not merely a tool of exchange. It is a social agreement anchored in trust, memory, and time. And when money is altered too freely, it is not prices that change first. It is behavior. What is unfolding now is not an inflationary episode. It is the maturation of a monetary regime that has been accumulating imbalance for decades. The surface symptoms are familiar: rising costs, compressed margins, persistent uncertainty. But the underlying cause is rarely discussed honestly. Modern states have chosen debasement over confrontation, not once, repeatedly, and each time the decision appeared rational. A crisis required intervention, a recession demanded stimulus, a financial system needed rescue. Each intervention expanded the supply of money beyond the productive capacity of the economy. At first, the effects were invisible. New money does not spread evenly. It concentrates. It flows first into financial institutions, asset markets, and those positioned closest to credit creation. This is why periods of monetary expansion often feel prosperous at the top. Asset values rise. Wealth appears to grow. Confidence strengthens. Meanwhile, the foundational relationship between money and real output quietly weakens. This weakening is cumulative, and it is irreversible without pain. The great illusion of modern economics is that inflation can be reversed painlessly, that tightening can restore balance without consequence. History offers no such example. Once the discipline of monetary scarcity is abandoned, restoration requires either collapse or repression. There is no elegant alternative. This is where the present moment becomes instructive. Over the past generation, public and private debt expanded to levels previously considered unthinkable. Deficits became permanent. Borrowing normalized. Interest was treated as a minor inconvenience. This was sustainable only because inflation remained subdued, or appeared to. In truth, inflation was not absent. It was misdirected. It inflated assets rather than wages, balance sheets rather than livelihoods. This misdirection created the impression of stability. But stability built on distortion cannot endure. When inflation finally migrates from assets to necessities, it reveals what has been happening all along. Not a sudden failure, a long-delayed reckoning. This reckoning is not ideological, it is mathematical. When obligations exceed productive capacity, adjustment is unavoidable. The question is never whether adjustment will occur, only how it will be paid for, and by whom. Historically, societies choose the same answer. They choose time. They choose gradual erosion over immediate crisis. They choose inflation because it distributes pain silently. Savings decay quietly. Wages lag discreetly. Living standards adjust downward without announcement. This is why inflation is often described as the most politically efficient form of taxation. It requires no vote. It provokes no single moment of revolt. It operates continuously. The middle class absorbs its weight disproportionately. Not because it is targeted, but because its wealth is structured around promises of stability. Savings, fixed incomes, deferred rewards. These are virtues in sound monetary systems. They are liabilities in inflationary ones. Those with access to assets, leverage, and pricing power adapt. Those whose security depends on money retaining meaning do not. This is not moral judgment. It is structural reality. The present trajectory suggests that inflation will not retreat to the margins. It will become a condition, managed, adjusted to, explained away, but never resolved. Because resolution would require choices no government is willing to make. Choices that would expose the limits of the system openly. And exposure is always delayed as long as possible. This delay has consequences. The longer imbalance is tolerated, the deeper it embeds itself into expectations. People change how they think about saving, about work, about the future. Trust erodes slowly, not in institutions alone, but in the logic of effort itself. When effort no longer guarantees preservation, behavior shifts. This is the silent damage inflation inflicts. Not immediate hardship, but long-term disorientation. In the next part, we will examine the precise stages that every currency debasement follows, not as metaphor, but as structure, and identify where the present system now stands within that historical sequence. Because once the pattern is recognized, the illusion of uniqueness disappears, and with it, the false comfort that this time will be different. Every era convinces itself that it has escaped the constraints that governed the past. That belief is not arrogance. It is inheritance. Each generation receives a system already functioning, already legitimized, already defended by expertise and tradition. Questioning its foundations feels unnecessary, even impolite. And yet, monetary systems are not judged by intention. They are judged by arithmetic. When arithmetic is ignored long enough, it asserts itself without negotiation. This is the point at which the present system now stands. Not at collapse, not at crisis, but at exposure. To understand why inflation has become structural rather than episodic, one must abandon the language of policy and return to first principles. Money is a claim on future production. That claim is only valid if future production can plausibly honor it. When claims multiply faster than capacity, the discrepancy must be resolved. There are only three mechanisms available: default, austerity, debasement. Default destroys confidence instantly. Austerity destroys legitimacy gradually. Debasement preserves appearances while hollowing substance. Every complex society chooses debasement, not because it is wise, because it is survivable. This choice has been made repeatedly over the past half-century, each time with justification, each time with explanation, each time with the promise of reversibility. But debasement is not reversible in the way policymakers imagine. It is cumulative. Once introduced, it alters behavior, and altered behavior reshapes the system. This is where the discussion must move beyond price indices and interest rates. Inflation is not a number. It is a process of behavioral adaptation. In its early stages, inflation is invisible to most. It manifests in asset appreciation, not daily expense. Those positioned near credit creation experience it as prosperity. This creates political insulation. Public concern remains muted. Confidence appears intact. Expansion feels justified. This stage can persist for decades. During this period, the economy becomes addicted to monetary accommodation. Growth expectations adjust upward. Debt levels normalize. Risk tolerance increases. Eventually, the system requires ever greater intervention to maintain the same effect. This is the logic of dependency. The moment accommodation slows, instability emerges. This is why inflation accelerates, not because of recklessness, but because of precedent. Each crisis teaches the system that expansion is permissible. Each intervention raises the baseline. Until restraint becomes inconceivable, the next stage arrives quietly. Inflation migrates from assets to necessities. This is when the public begins to notice. Living costs rise faster than wages. Savings lose purchasing power. Certainty dissolves. At this point, explanations multiply. Temporary disruptions. External shocks. Unforeseen events. Some are true. None are sufficient. Because the underlying cause is not episodic. It is structural. The system now requires inflation to function. Without it, obligations cannot be met. This is where the arithmetic becomes unforgiving. As debt expands, interest obligations expand with it. Raising rates to control inflation increases servicing costs. Increased servicing costs expand deficits. Expanded deficits demand further borrowing. This feedback loop is not theoretical, it is observable. At a certain scale, it becomes irreversible. Attempts to exit it result in crisis. Thus, inflation becomes the least disruptive option, not the best, the least destabilizing. This is the moment when inflation shifts from failure to policy, not declared, but embedded. From this point onward, managing inflation replaces eliminating it. Language changes. Targets are adjusted. Definitions are refined. Expectations are guided. But the direction remains fixed. This phase produces a peculiar contradiction. Official stability coexists with private anxiety. Institutions project control. Individuals sense erosion. This divergence is corrosive. Trust does not collapse suddenly. It thins. People continue to participate, but with altered expectations. They shorten time horizons. They prioritize immediacy. They become less willing to defer gratification. These are rational adaptations. But collectively, they accelerate inflationary dynamics. Velocity increases, savings decline, speculation rises. Inflation begins to feed itself psychologically. This is the most dangerous transition. Not because prices rise rapidly, but because behavior changes irreversibly. Once people internalize the expectation of erosion, restoring confidence becomes exponentially harder. Even if inflation slows, the memory remains. This is why societies that endure prolonged inflation never fully return to previous norms. Something essential is lost: the ability to trust time. Now consider where the present system resides within this sequence. The early asset inflation phase is complete. The migration to necessities has occurred. Debt dynamics have reached a scale that precludes normalization. What remains is the psychological transition, the moment when people cease believing that stability will return on its own. This is not yet universal, which is precisely why it matters. Those who recognize this transition early adapt quietly. Those who do not experience it as betrayal later. The tragedy of inflation is not its existence. It is its opacity. It disguises cause and effect. It rewards proximity rather than contribution. It punishes discipline without explanation. This breeds resentment and confusion invites simplistic narratives. Historically, this is where societies fracture intellectually before they fracture politically. Inflation does not merely redistribute wealth, it redistributes meaning. Work feels less valuable, saving feels irrational, patience feels naive. In such an environment, cohesion erodes. This erosion is not dramatic, it is ambient. It colors every decision subtly. Nowhere is this more visible than in the middle strata of society. Those whose security depends on predictability suffer disproportionately. Not because they lack resilience, but because the system no longer rewards the behaviors it once did. Deferred gratification, incremental progress, long-term planning. These virtues presuppose monetary stability. Without it, they become vulnerabilities. Those with assets that reprice dynamically adapt. Those with fixed claims erode. This is not ideology. It is structure. Understanding this distinction is the dividing line between adaptation and attrition. In the next part, we will examine how prolonged inflation reshapes social behavior, political legitimacy, and individual psychology, and why the greatest damage occurs not during crisis, but during prolonged adjustment. Because the most dangerous thing inflation destroys is not wealth. It is orientation. When inflation persists long enough, it ceases to feel like an economic event and begins to resemble an atmosphere. Not something that happens, something that surrounds. People no longer speak of prices rising. They speak of value dissolving. This distinction matters because price is numerical, value is psychological, and psychology, once altered, is far harder to restore than balance sheets. At this stage, inflation is no longer merely redistributive. It becomes formative. It reshapes how individuals interpret effort, risk, loyalty, and time. The first casualty is patience. In stable monetary environments, patience is rewarded. One can defer consumption, invest effort, and reasonably expect continuity between present sacrifice and future security. Inflation fractures that continuity. When purchasing power erodes steadily, deferral feels punitive. Waiting becomes costly. The rational response is acceleration. Consume sooner. Invest sooner. Demand returns sooner. This is not greed. It is adaptation. But when patience disappears at scale, so does long-term thinking. Projects shorten. Commitments weaken. Institutions struggle to plan beyond immediate horizons. This creates a subtle but profound shift. The future becomes abstract. The present becomes dominant. The second casualty is trust. Not trust in any single authority, but trust in the coherence of the system itself. When official explanations fail to align with lived experience, credibility decays. Not explosively, incrementally. People do not revolt. They disengage. They comply outwardly while withdrawing inwardly. Civic participation becomes performative. Consensus thins. This is how societies become brittle without appearing unstable. The third casualty is meaning. Work under inflationary pressure feels less anchored. Effort no longer correlates clearly with outcome. One may work diligently and still fall behind. This creates moral confusion. If discipline no longer guarantees preservation, why remain disciplined? If prudence no longer protects, why remain prudent? These questions are rarely voiced aloud. They are absorbed silently. And silence is how inflation exerts its deepest influence. This is why prolonged inflation changes cultures. It rewards those closest to monetary flows. It marginalizes those furthest from them. It elevates financial engineering over productive contribution. And over time, this inversion becomes normalized. The system begins to appear arbitrary. Not unjust, arbitrary. This distinction is important. Injustice provokes resistance. Arbitrariness provokes apathy. Apathy is far more dangerous because it drains societies of the energy required for reform. At this stage, political responses follow predictable patterns. Leaders emphasize resilience. They appeal to shared sacrifice. They promise eventual normalization. None of these are lies, but none address structure, because structure cannot be addressed without confrontation, and confrontation is avoided as long as possible. So inflation is managed rhetorically. Narratives are refined, metrics adjusted, responsibility diffused. This creates a peculiar dynamic. The system insists on optimism. The population feels uncertainty. The gap between message and experience widens. When this gap becomes too visible, legitimacy weakens, not through outrage, through irony. People listen politely, then ignore. This is how inflation erodes authority without overthrowing it. The most revealing consequence emerges in how people relate to risk. In stable systems, risk is optional. One can choose safety and still progress. In inflationary systems, safety becomes risky. Holding stable claims guarantees erosion. Avoiding risk ensures decline. Thus, individuals are pushed toward speculation, not because they desire it, but because standing still is no longer neutral. This is how bubbles proliferate, not from mania alone, but from necessity. When risk becomes compulsory, Judgment deteriorates. This dynamic is often misinterpreted as irrational exuberance. It is not. It is forced participation. This is why inflationary eras produce volatility not only in markets, but in behavior. Confidence swings, mood oscillates, hope and anxiety coexist. People feel simultaneously compelled and constrained. This psychological tension accumulates. It does not resolve itself. Eventually, something must give. Historically, societies exit prolonged inflation through one of two paths. Either through a decisive restructuring that reasserts monetary discipline, or through stagnation that normalizes erosion indefinitely. Both paths are costly. One is abrupt, the other is slow. The present system appears inclined toward the latter, not because it is preferred, but because it avoids visible rupture. Yet stagnation has consequences that are often underestimated. Living standards plateau, social mobility narrows, meritocratic narratives weaken, and over time, a quiet stratification hardens, not along ideological lines, but along proximity to assets. This is how inflation transforms inequality from an economic statistic into a lived condition. The danger is not revolt, it is resignation. A society that resigns itself to erosion becomes inward-looking. It loses ambition. It tolerates mediocrity. And once that tolerance sets in, renewal becomes exceedingly difficult. Understanding this trajectory is not pessimism, it is realism. History does not punish societies for error, it punishes them for denial. Inflation, when acknowledged early, can be navigated. When obscured, it metastasizes. The critical question is not whether inflation will persist. It is whether individuals will recognize the environment they are in and adapt intelligently. Adaptation does not require cynicism. It requires clarity. Clarity about what money can no longer guarantee. Clarity about which behaviors the system now rewards. Clarity about where stability truly resides. In the final part, we will confront the uncomfortable implications of this reality. Not in terms of prediction, but in terms of responsibility. Because when systems drift, responsibility does not disappear. It decentralizes. And understanding that shift may be the most valuable form of security remaining. When systems drift without resolution, responsibility does not vanish. It migrates. From institutions to individuals, from policy to perception, from guarantees to judgment. This is the quiet conclusion of every prolonged inflationary era. Not collapse, reallocation of burden. Those waiting for a definitive moment, a declaration, a reset, a return to normal, misunderstand the nature of the process. There is no moment. There is only acclimation. Inflation reshapes reality slowly enough that each adjustment feels tolerable in isolation. Only in retrospect does the transformation appear dramatic. This is why inflation rarely provokes rebellion. It produces something far more enduring: adaptation. People adapt not by protest, but by recalibration. They lower expectations. They shorten horizons. They redefine success. This adaptive behavior is rational, but it carries a cost. It narrows possibility. A society that adapts downward eventually forgets what expansion felt like. This is the unspoken danger, not deprivation, diminishment. The final stage of prolonged inflation is not crisis. It is acceptance. Acceptance that stability will not return as it once existed. Acceptance that money no longer stores meaning reliably. Acceptance that security must be constructed rather than assumed. This acceptance can produce two outcomes, one passive, one deliberate. The passive response is resignation. Individuals disengage from long-term aspiration. They focus on maintenance rather than progress. They become cautious, defensive, inward. This response preserves survival at the expense of vitality. The deliberate response is orientation, a conscious reassessment of how the world now functions. Orientation does not resist reality. It aligns with it. This distinction is subtle but decisive. Those who orient themselves do not attempt to restore a past system. They operate intelligently within the present one. They understand that inflation does not abolish opportunity. It alters its form. Opportunity migrates away from promises toward processes, away from nominal guarantees toward adaptive structures. This requires a different mindset, not optimism, not pessimism, discernment. Discernment begins with abandoning comforting myths, the myth that inflation is temporary by default, the myth that authorities possess tools without limits, the myth that stability is the natural state of complex systems. History offers no support for these assumptions. Stability is constructed, maintained, defended. And when its cost exceeds political tolerance, it is abandoned quietly. Understanding this is not radical. It is historical literacy. The societies that endured inflation best were not those with the strongest currencies. They were those with the clearest understanding of their environment. Clarity enables preparation. Preparation enables continuity. Continuity preserves dignity. This is the real stakes, not wealth accumulation, but coherence. The ability to make decisions that align effort with outcome. The ability to preserve agency in an environment designed to obscure it. This does not require extraordinary action. It requires modest realism. Recognizing that money now functions less as a store of value and more as a medium of motion. That time must be managed actively rather than trusted implicitly. That security resides in adaptability, not assurance. These insights are not dramatic. They are stabilizing. They remove the shock from erosion. They replace surprise with structure, and structure is calming. This is why understanding inflation deeply is not alarming. It is grounding. It restores proportion. It reveals that what feels unprecedented is often familiar, that what feels personal is often systemic, that what feels chaotic is often patterned. Inflation is not a moral failure. It is a coordination failure. It emerges when collective obligations exceed collective capacity. It persists when resolution threatens cohesion more than erosion does. and it ends only when adjustment becomes unavoidable. Until then, life continues, not normally, but navigably. Those who grasp this early experience fewer shocks. Those who cling to outdated assumptions experience repeated disappointment. This is not because the world has become hostile, but because it has changed its rules. Rules that were never permanent, only assumed to be. If you have remained engaged through this entire analysis, it suggests an appetite for understanding rather than reassurance. That appetite matters. Depth matters. Not because it predicts the future, but because it clarifies the present. And clarity is the rarest form of advantage. If this perspective sharpened your understanding rather than inflamed your emotions, supporting work of this nature encourages more of it. Measured engagement signals that seriousness still has an audience. Sharing it with someone whose judgment you respect may open a conversation worth sustaining. And if you choose to leave a comment, let it reflect thought rather than agreement. Insight advances through dialogue, not affirmation. Thank you for your attention. In an age of acceleration, attention remains the most deliberate act of all.